It was almost 4 years ago today that I was participating in a MAS panel, actually standing right here, on the future of industrial architecture in New York. On that day, the City Council had just voted to overturn the landmarks designation for the Austin Nichols and Company warehouse. One of the council members in that hearing called the building a piece of garbage. In the 4 years since the council took that misguided vote, a lot has happened to industrial architecture in Brooklyn and beyond.
America was once an industrial powerhouse with major manufacturing centers that included New York City. Our city hosted, among other things, the world's largest sugar refinery, Domino, the world's largest commercial bakery, Nabisco, in Chelsea, now the Chelsea Market, the world's largest rope factory, now a burned ruin in Greenpoint. We are losing those connections, the memory of how we make things or even that we did and still do. The large spaces of factories are extremely adaptable to any use that requires big open spaces. Museums have learned to take advantage of this. And Europe has not missed out on this trend. The most well-known industrial building transformed into an art museum is undoubtedly the Tate Modern in London. The Centrale Montemartini, however, is my favorite power plant turned into an art museum. It opened as a power plant in 1900. It ceased operations in the 1960s, and the museum opened to the public in 1997. Unlike the Tate Modern, they kept the power plant equipment and used it as a foil for the sculpture. Europe is really far ahead of us in valuing its industrial heritage and recycling its historic buildings. Actually going to end by returning to the United States. This is the Glenwood Power Station in Yonkers, New York. And I think a lot of you have heard the quote that I believe is from Carl Elefante, that the greenest building is one that's already built. Many preservationists like Donovan Ripkema talk about embodied energy, that is the labor and the finite fuel resources that we've already expended to put up a building like this. The fuel to bake the bricks and to fire the kiln for the cement, to manufacture the windows and doors, the steel beams and the roof trusses. I like to say the greenest building is the one you don't send to a landfill.
MAS has been involved in this issue for a long time, largely because of our concern about the waterfronts, our deep concern about retaining our industrial and manufacturing jobs in our maritime industry, and also in terms of preservation, acknowledging the importance that the preservation of our industrial heritage has to placemaking and retaining the identity of New York City. In 2005, the city proposed rezoning in Greenpoint, Williamsburg. What once was a very powerful manufacturing and industrial center in New York still had a lot of industrial jobs and a great wealth of industrial buildings. The rezoning was 184 blocks. Our deep concern was that so few historic resources were identified in the environmental impact statement in the rezoning. I think it's in part because we sort of have lost our appreciation for the architectural and cultural and historic significance of the industrial buildings. In fact, in the 184 blocks, the city identified about 18 buildings. We worked hard to survey buildings. We came up with a list of a couple hundred significant buildings. After the rezoning, the Greenpoint Terminal Market was lost in a suspicious fire. Also at the same time, the Landmarks Commission had designated the Austin Nichols warehouse a Cass Gilbert designed building. It was de-designated by the City Council, and at the time, this was the renovation that was planned. We nominated the Brooklyn's industrial heritage to the National Trust list of 11 most endangered places, and last year they put it first on the list. I want to touch on a little bit of infrastructure issues. This is the graving dock in Red Hook. This graving dock was part of the Todd shipyards, and at the time this was the largest graving dock in the world. We became involved when IKEA planned to move here and fill the graving dock and pave it over for a parking lot. It was in active use for ship repair. There's a lot of people employed here. We thought the absolute best use for this would be ship repair. We looked for other examples for how graving docks were used around the world. There's some really fascinating uses, mostly in Europe, where they, I think, have a sort of a better sense of retaining things. On the right, you see a park in Belfast. It's an industrial park where they've retained their graving docks. They simply keep them as site features. Some are full of water, some are drained. So there were opportunities here other than what happened, which is, this is the IKEA. They did an outline of the graving dock in the parking lot. And the real outrage here is that EDC has issued a report saying that the city's maritime industry, to stay competitive, needs 7 new graving docks. This came out the day that IKEA opened. And they said with expansion of the maritime industry in South Brooklyn, if we retain our infrastructure, build more, there's an opportunity for 500 jobs in South Brooklyn, in the Red Hook area. Those are 500 good jobs. IKEA did bring 500 jobs, but certainly lower paying than in the industrial and manufacturing and maritime ones.
The Navy Yard is a 300-acre site. It goes back to 1801. The Navy established the Navy Yard, built ships all the way until 1966. The Maine, the Missouri, the Arizona. The Monitor was outfitted there before it went down to fight the Merrimack in the Civil War. Peak employment during World War II of 70,000 people. Mary mentioned earlier that New York was the heart of manufacturing. The Brooklyn Navy Yard and the communities surrounding it were the heart of manufacturing in the entire United States for decades. Closed in '66, the city bought it. First there was one not-for-profit, then came the Brooklyn Navy Yard Development Corporation, and we're making enormous progress. Our mission at core is to create industrial jobs, particularly manufacturing within that category, which is very broad, and I'll talk about that. Maximize revenue, achieve self-sufficiency. We have an enormous amount of city capital that's required to put into the city today because of 50 years of deferred maintenance since the Navy left. Our goal is to be able to say to the city, you don't need to keep plowing tens of millions of dollars into the Navy Yard every year. Develop underutilized areas, modernize the Yard's infrastructure, all now with a major commitment to preservation, sustainability, and improved community presence. As a result of major investment by the city in our basic infrastructure, water, sewer, roads, we've leveraged that into $265 million of private investment and over 2,000 jobs coming down the pike, emerging industrial sectors, and I think this is key for us because people often, when they think about manufacturing, they think about the 1950s. That ain't coming back to New York City, but what is here, what we believe is 21st century manufacturing, are scores of artists and artisans that are doing interesting work. There are 50-plus furniture manufacturers in the Navy Yard, scores of commercial artists, entertainment and media, life sciences I don't have up here, but I think that'll emerge. Green manufacturing is an overlay in all these different sectors and is just exploding at the Navy Yard. Obviously, with a city going from 8 to 9 million people, you've got to have a core amount of warehouse distribution. That also is sustainable because it keeps the trucks off the street, particularly coming in from Port Elizabeth across our bridges. Pry Associates, and this is a story that's repeated over and over again at the Navy Yard. These guys came to the Navy Yard 8 years ago, took 2,000 square feet, some young computer engineers from Cooper Union. They bid essentially on a lark on a Defense Department contract. They're now the largest designers and suppliers of body armor for the Army Special Forces, the FBI, and when you go into their space, they now have 30,000 square feet and 75 employees. In the front is a lot of very smart-looking people at computers designing various different body armor. And in the back of the space, they have people manufacturing the prototypes. Their large-scale manufacturing happens down south. But that's the kind of job that should be in New York City because you're capitalizing on the intellectual capital here and then the great local workforce.
We were the preservation consultants, for the Austin, Nichols and Company warehouse. As many of you know, this is a prominent building on the Brooklyn waterfront, a Cass Gilbert design building with its simplicity of design, the rhythmic fenestration of the windows. So it's a wonderful building to work with, very simple and very practical for the purposes of the design for the warehouse. This building was built as the headquarters for Austin, Nichols and Company. It was a major distributor of goods in the Port of New York and elsewhere in the area. It's the largest, I believe, the largest distributor in the Port of New York. So in 2007, the decision was made to move forward with renovating the building using the historic tax credits and converting the building into rental apartments. And the renovation would take advantage of the federal tax credits.
And I'd like to thank you all for coming and thank our speakers.